Well, welcome to the hot house. We prepared this especially for tonight. No, we did not prepare it. The climate prepared it especially for tonight. And we are the recipient of often toasty nights here because we choose not to use electricity, and I see Douglas is asking for me to speak up, so I will. The series is called Hoodwinked in the Greenwashed Mountains. Explicit. We have been appalled at what's going on here in Vermont, what you see in the politics of the state, what you hear in the news. It's like, for me anyway, it's like, what story are they talking about? Because it's tragic. You know, what attempts are being made at supposedly addressing climate action. I'm not going to go too far because I'm going to let Earl do the little intro, but I do want to mention the work, of course, is to start telling the other real stories that need to be told, because the mass media and what people are receiving is an entirely different story. And so Hoodwinked in the Hot House, which is this booklet, which is produced by, I think, like 19 national, or North American, I should say, organizations that have gotten together and really scrutinized the false solutions that are being put forward. I want to talk just specifically about this because one of the efforts, of course, is for you to learn through this series, but also we're doing a thing called the Hoodwinked in the Hot House Circles. So just community conversations. Community conversations with just small groups of people. 5 to 10 people. We'll sit down, we'll go through it. We already have one circle here happening right here in this space over the course of the summer, not heavy lift. It's only 70 pages with lots of beautiful visuals, and we go through it, and you get to learn about the many, many aspects of the false solutions that are being perpetrated on us. So it's a learning curve. It's a big learning curve for many of us in the past, at least for me, for just the past 2 years, just learning the falsehoods that was perpetrated through the Vermont legislature and the whole politics. It was pretty stunning, but also very complicated to actually speak properly to the issues. So there is some understanding that needs to be done. This is the second in the series, but I welcome anybody who wants to sit in a circle, and we're hopefully going to be doing these. 350 Vermont is going to be doing these circles around the state. So just pull 5 people together, conversation, meet 2 or 3 times, read through the, it's a simple. At our first meeting, we started with the glossary, and actually very interestingly ended with a long discussion on the doctrine of discovery, which a lot of people didn't understand. What's the doctrine of, well, now you're talking the history, so now you're really getting into the context. I see we have an important, a lawyer here in the room.
The first case of the property price.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there you go. But many of us don't understand, or don't know, and aren't aware of where our history comes from because we're not taught it in schools. Anyway, I don't want to go on too long.
Are you offering that booklet?
Yes, I can also offer this booklet to you.
For sale?
No, that's for taking away. I'm going to hand this one to you after I hand it over to Earl Hatley, who is also a member of this team that's putting together these conversations. The next one is the 20th of this month. In 2 weeks, we will hear from Meg Sheehan. Meg Sheehan is the is an environmental lawyer, and she's the founder of the North American Megadam Resistance Alliance. So we'll be talking about hydropower and the rights of rivers. So important material. Anyway, I want to hand it over to Earl now. I'm going on too long and I'm stuck. Stuck to the ant trap. Yeah, watch out.
Watch out for that, yeah.
I don't know what that is. I don't recognize it. Thanks, Chris. Doctrine of Discovery. Got an expert over there. Cool. I was ragging on the Pope. That's how that whole conversation got started. The Pope rescinded the Doctrine of Discovery, so that's going to make a big difference for our indigenous peoples in terms of land ownership. I was just talking about that today. The tribes don't own our land. We don't own our reservations. The federal government does. But without the Doctrine of Discovery, who owns it? I'm Earl Hatley, Quay. I'm an enrolled member of the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi. I don't talk like a Yankee because I'm from Oklahoma. And no, it's not hot.
Here.
Not here. It is there. About 30 degrees hotter than it is in this building right now. People asked me a while ago if I thought it was hot. And I just had to look at them funny. I finally feel comfortable. It's not cold. I'm not cold. Yay. Vermont's cold. It's a cold place. So I'm from Oklahoma. My father was Shawnee and Cherokee. I lived my life on the Cherokee Res there in Oklahoma. My mom was from the Odanak area of Quebec. Migrated, both sides of her family were Abenaki. They migrated to Vermont and then later to Rhode Island. So I've been here full-time for 3 years. I've had my place in Quechee for 5 years. So I'm here learning about my mom's peoples and living among them and all of you. And we're having a lot of fun being hoodwinked together and learning how that happens and all about that and making a mess. And so I want to read a little bit from Hoodwinked. My copy was given to me by Tom Goldtooth of the Indigenous Environmental Network. So I'm proud of my copy. I'm not going to give it away. Mother Earth is the source of all life, which needs to be protected, not a source to be exploited and commodified as natural capital, as an ecosystem service, or as a nature-based solution. We urge all humanity to bring our hearts, spirits, minds, and bodies together to transform the social structures, economies, institutions, and power relations that underpin our deprivation, oppression, and exploitation. We only have one Mother Earth and one Father Sky. Read this. You can get it for free online. We have some here. You can get more. This is really important. What we're saying in this series comes out of the book. It's got a lot of references, so you want to do a deep dive if you're a techie. All the references are here for you to have a lot of fun for a long time about all these false solutions. And these are being perpetrated upon us by our legislature, and we found that out this year during the legislative session. All of the false solutions in this book are coming out of the state legislature at us. Instead of wind, solar, battery storage, we're getting everything but that. And at one point in this series, I'm going to talk about how they're not true solutions either, and what we can do and what would really be better. Although we do need to make that transition, we need to go into it with our eyes open. So at any rate, this series talks about these false solutions and the legislature and how the utilities are pushing them, and the lobbyists are making them the best politicians money can buy for us. and how the Green Mountain State is being greenwashed and hoodwinked. And so the speakers in this series that we're bringing in are experts on these false solutions. And so it's really great and an honor to have all of you here. And this is being filmed, so watch out what you say. And no, I'm just kidding. Say what you feel and think, because everybody wants to know and wants to hear this. And this is going to be replayed and allowed to be replayed for our communities all across Vermont, because this is an educational series. We want everyone to hear about these false solutions so that we can talk about it, educate our neighbors about it, so that when the next legislative session comes up and they start considering the next bills, the renewable energy standard, which will be coming out next, we want to make sure that we finally get the real solutions and we get good solutions and not these biofuels, biomass, more Hydro-Quebec, and on. So tonight we're going to be talking about false solutions, how to tell what is a false solution and who is promoting them. And did you want to introduce Rachel?
Why don't you? Easy.
Okay, so we have Rachel Smolker is here with us, co-founder, founder and co-director of global climate organization Biofuelwatch. And I'll let, come on up and let's give her a big hand for being here with us.
Thank you so much, everybody, for sitting here in what a hot day it is today. I think it was the world's hottest recorded day on Tuesday, and so how appropriate that we should be here having this conversation where we are sweating to death and having to run electricity in order to just be in a livable room. Geez, it's my pleasure to be here, and I thank you for inviting me, for Chris and Dale. As co-director of Biofuelwatch, I feel like I've had a lot of experience with false solutions. It's kind of been my career because, biofuels were brought into play as a supposed solution to the greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. And that has led from that point on to an entire world of everything made from that thin living biosphere that surrounds our planet, as opposed to the buried fossil, intensely concentrated energy, as if we can just simply use this delicate living systems that support us as energy and as fuel and as materials to carry on with this lifetime habits of consumption that we have come to see as the norm for lifestyles in many parts of the world, including where we are. So I was asked to speak in broad terms about false solutions. What are they? Why? Who benefits? Who loses? And in some ways, I think the answers to those questions are pretty easy, actually, and especially for people who immerse themselves in efforts to do something about climate change for any length of time. But there are a lot of people for whom this is a new endeavor. They're stepping in now and saying, yeah, climate change really is a concern. It's pretty hot today. Maybe it's not a hoax after all. And they're trying to understand, what can I do? And we have to allow people to kind of travel this trajectory of learning that they need to do in order to come to terms with what's happening. And it may start with being completely, in denial about climate change, and then come to recognizing that it is a problem, and then hearing what other people might say, like a legislator saying this affordable heat standard or this new, heat fuel or magical fairy dust is the solution. And if you don't really have a means to do the evaluation, you're likely to feel like, hey, I'm doing something. So in the audience here today, we have Ann Peterman, who is a longtime colleague of mine. Wave your hand, Ann. Looking a little bit wilted at the moment. But I wanted to introduce her because she helped me on that trajectory tremendously. I had been 10 years of a stay-at-home mom, and I had been a wildlife biologist before that. And I was wondering, kicking around what to do, and Anne and Oren had their organization, Global Justice Ecology Project, was based in Heinsberg, where I live, and I kind of stumbled into their office, and Anne gave me a stack of books about that big, which I read in about a week and came back and said, okay, now what? And I worked with them for many years and continue to do so. A couple of years ago, we helped organize, and Anne's organization, Global Justice Ecology Project, spearheaded an event which we called the Forest Convergence, and it was held in southern Illinois. And we did a workshop there on false solutions. And at that workshop, there were just a handful of people who attended, but we had a really good, small group of very thoughtful people. And we were trying to figure out what could we do that would help the growing youth movement who's stepping onto this trajectory of learning to get up to speed. And we immediately thought of the prior editions of the Hoodwinked, which had been done by Rising Tide and Carbon Trade Watch and some of the other organizations that we had been working with, going to the climate COPs and doing the whole international circuit for some years, and built up this Climate Justice Now and climate justice movement during those years. And the Hoodwinked, the first couple of editions of Hoodwinked had come out of all of that work with this international movement of climate justice organizers. And we thought the easy thing to do would be to just do another issue, another updated version of this Hoodwinked document. And we went and suggested it to a few of the people that had been involved in the earlier editions, and it just immediately took off with flames and energy and a lot of enthusiasm. So it's exciting to see how something like that can move through to come to circles here in Royalton of people who are studying this issue and taking it and using this tool, because that's what it was always intended to be. So again, as co-director of Biofuelwatch, I get just barraged with false solutions. I mean, we're going to burn trees and turn them into charcoal and use it as a substitute for coal, or we're going to burn trees and we're going to ship them up and we're going to send them to Europe and burn them in a coal plant as an alternative to coal, or we're going to make plastic out of wood instead, or something. We're going to make new transportation fuels that are, quote, carbon negative and, et cetera, out of magical fairy dust, and we want all the subsidies in the world to come into our laps. Here we go. It's all going to be great and wonderful. And I mean, it's hard to convey how upsetting it is to see this and to just be barraged with these, daily onslaught of people who are willing to tell lies in order to get the money to propagate false solutions to a crisis that threatens all of us and all of life on Earth. Like, it's just the moral lack of, any moral character that it would be required to go out there and start advocating for some of these solutions is just astonishing and can be very, very disheartening at times. So I've actually been taking kind of a sabbatical this past year because I just got so depressed by watching this constant barrage and feeling like, the renewable fuel standard, for example, was passed back in like 2007. That's where Biofuelwatch first came together. And that was, when people were talking about, well, does it really make sense to burn food in a car? Because, rich people have cars, but a lot of people need to eat besides the rich people who drive their cars and want to look green, right? And the renewable fuel standard was passed. There was a lot of upheaval, and there was rioting going on. There was, an economic downturn that was happening globally, and people were really struggling. And here in the US, we were passing this law to burn food in our car engines and essentially linking up the market for energy with food and agriculture. And by putting those things into the same bucket, we were putting them in competition with each other. And that was where Biofuelwatch kind of came together, working internationally with people on these issues. Another thing about the renewable fuel standard was that they mandated, this whole elaborate schedule of different kinds of fuels and different levels of subsidies for different kinds of fuels. And among them was the requirement for cellulosic biofuels. So burning corn was meant to be a stepping stone, or whatever the term is, a bridge fuel to, we were all heard of that bridge fuel, right? Bridge fuel to better, more climate-friendly fuels made from waste and residue, just the stalks from the corn and the straw and that stuff, and not the food. But since 2007, there's essentially no commercial production of cellulosic biofuels, and instead we're just burning more and more food crops and filling in the volume requirements for the renewable fuel standard that way. Can you move on to the next slide for me? I think before I launch into this, I put the blah, blah, blah for 30 years there because I always loved that quote, and that's just kind of hit me so hard when she said that, Greta Thunberg, this little kid. This is not about some, this was at the G7, I think, that she said this in 2021. It's not about some expensive, politically correct, bunny-hugging, build back better, green economy, net zero by 2050, climate neutral thing. This is our hopes and dreams that are drowning in your empty words. And that, I think, sums it up. That really sums it up. And she was very powerful in saying that. Because 30 years have gone by with the international negotiations and the governments all saying, we're going to do this, and our nationally determined contributions, and our blah, 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 blah. And emissions have only gone up and up and up and up. And there has been so many lies and so much obfuscation that real solutions are happening, but they're kind of hidden and they're very not getting the support and the momentum that they need to be getting. So since I was asked to kind of talk in broad terms, I thought about, well, what kinds of false solutions do we see? And I thought, okay, there's plain old lies. Climate change is a hoax, right? I saw this great photo while I was digging around. Climate change is a hoax. Climate change is real, and by the way, water is wet. I thought that was pretty cool. Anyway, so there's plain old lies, and we just have to keep fighting on that front. And really, in some ways, that sometimes feels like the most important front that we need to be fighting on. Sleight of hand. And this is the example that came to my mind was the Biden administration permitting oil extraction and fracking, even as he was signing bills that would provide funding for so-called solutions to climate change. So it's kind of like, look at here, that thing you do with a magic trick, look over here, sleight of hand. And there are a lot of different examples that you can come up with in the world of false solutions that fit the sleight of hand model. Then there's techno-fixes. And there's, this breed of human being who just loves these things, like just fantasizing. Sorry. They're just fantasizing about, miraculous new technologies that futuristic and we're going to, do everything with technology. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Larry Lohman, but he was one of the great writers who initially really brought into light the problems with the carbon marketing. And he wrote an essay recently that was called something of a Museum of the Fetishes, and he goes back in history and looks at some of what the 50 years ago, 100 years ago, what people were imagining in those futuristic visions. And it's kind of funny. It's like cars that can turn into boats, and even a woman can do it. It's really funny. It's a fun read, and I highly recommend it. But anyway, you have to have a sense of humor. Keep your sense of humor. So technofixes, one of the things Biofuelwatch has been involved in for quite some time has been working with the Hands Off Mother Earth campaign, which has been spearheaded by the Energy Technology Corrosion ETC group in Canada, and many other organizations that have been brought on board with this. The idea that we're going to spew sulfate particles into the stratosphere to shade the planet, or we're going to put fake ice over little styrofoam balls that look like ice and will reflect the light off the Arctic to prevent the ocean from absorbing heat. And you think this is just a joke, but there are moves afoot, legislative moves afoot in North America and elsewhere to be studying. There's been studies that have been funded, and there's moves afoot to really start examining climate geoengineering as a serious option. And the more dire the situation gets, the more urgency is feeding into the fray to bring these technologies into existence. So those are some of the engineering the climate fixes. There's also a couple of companies that are doing direct air capture, right? Which sounds really good. Like you just have a big fan, and as the air circulates through there, instead of filtering particulates, it filters out the CO2 molecules. The only problem with that is that it takes like 3 times as much energy to run the fans as it does to capture the amount of CO2. Because although we have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, it's actually pretty dilute. There's one over here, and there's one over there, and there's one over there. You've got to get a lot of air flowing through there. And then, of course, there's a problem what to do with it afterwards. But there's a lot of interest in burying stuff underground, Like you stick your head under the ground, you just stick the problem underground, you stick the carbon underground. So anyway, the techno fixes are a big class of false solutions. And then there are the distractions. We all heard about clean coal when we were infants, like even me. We heard about clean coal being, the next big fix that was going to make coal viable into the future. But all the dirty problems that come with coal would go away. Forget about the mountaintop removing, all that stuff. But the air pollution problems and the CO2 emissions would be taken care of because we would attach futuristic devices to the sides of these facilities that would capture the CO2 coming out of the smokestacks. And when we captured the CO2, we could bury it underground somewhere, in a hole in the ground. We'll figure that out. And we hope that it stays there because concentrated CO2 is actually deadly. So you don't want to have it leaking out in someone's living room. So CCS has been recently gotten a huge big burst of funding from the Biden administration.
What's it stand for?
Carbon capture and sequestration, sorry. So carbon capture and sequestration, clean coal, it's this technology for capturing basically at the smokestack and figuring out some place to put that stuff underground. And then came up, bioenergy and biomass, which is something that I spent a lot of years working on, and I think some of you are at least somewhat familiar with. But the IPCC, is based on these models. They do all these modeling studies looking at what different scenarios might result in. And as time has gone by and it's become really more and more clear that we are going to, quote, overshoot what the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions that would allow us to keep the climate at less than 1.5 degree warming, assuming we actually believe that we can just make these numbers and those models and it's all going to work, which is another big question, but they are useful. They have, in their models, they got to a point where they just couldn't make it work to keep things below 1.5. So they started talking about how are we going to not just stop putting CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, how are we going to figure out how to take it out once it's already there so we can overshoot the curve, and then sometime in the future, and they have all these different models for what technologies are going to come along in the future and do that, maybe, we hope, or not. And bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration was the technology that they said was the most mature, even though it actually doesn't exist anywhere except ethanol plants if you consider the fermentation of corn and capturing the CO2 from that. But there are no biomass facilities like McNeil that capture their carbon emissions and bury it underground. No, there's no such thing. But the reason they wanted to promote this idea was because by assuming that if you burn wood or biomass and it's carbon neutral, right? Because if you burn a new tree is going to grow and it'll be the same amount of carbon, it'll balance out, so it's carbon neutral. That's the mythology. And if you adopt and accept that mythology, if you then capture the CO2, you're actually going not just neutral, but negative, because you are capturing carbon from a neutral process and then burying it away in underground. And so you have a carbon, quote, negative. Well, this is all based on really faulty accounting and nonsense, and the perhaps most upsetting part of it is that virtually all of the CCS projects that have been tried so far have essentially failed. They're $1 million project, $1 billion projects. I took some notes because I had to have this in hand. But for example, the Kemper facility, which was these are coal facilities and natural gas facilities. Like I said, there's never been tried with biomass, in spite of the fact that it's kind of favored in these models that are so popular. The Kemper facility in Mississippi, in a very low-income part of Mississippi, was projected to cost $1.8 billion, and it ran over $7.5 billion before the developers were charged with fraud, and the plant was basically mothballed. And that was 10 years after it was supposed to have become operational. It never operated. It never captured any CO2. The Gorgon facility, which is a Chevron facility in West Australia, which really bugged me because I just spent a lot of time right near Barrow Island, which was completely leveled for this facility. It's a liquid natural gas facility, and they decided to try doing carbon capture and sequestration from the processing of the gas, which has been done in other places actually. But it has completely failed. They've captured something like 17%, I think, of the CO2 that they were going to capture. And they discovered that there was a lot of water in the island, sandy island, and that was corroding the equipment, and the whole thing has just not worked. But the LNG part of it is working just fine, thank you. And then there's the Petronova facility, which is down in Texas. That's another one that I think they just decided recently to like blow it up or something. I may be confusing this with another, don't quote me, but that was another big project that was supposed to capture a lot of carbon and bury it underground, and has, I think, been completely mothballed at this point. And one of the interesting things about that was that it brought up the whole issue of the lack of transparency about these technologies, because they pretty much just said, we're not telling you why it failed or what we really tried. So there's not a learning curve, much as many of the environmental organizations like Clean Air Task Force, who support and lobby for these carbon capture and sequestration funds, will say it's a learning curve and this was great because we tried it and we figured it out and we'll eventually get it. But there's no transparency within the industry and within the circles that are working on developing this. Then there's not a learning curve and we're not going to get there. It's about getting the subsidies. It's about perpetuating the industries, the LNG industry, the coal plants, and so on and so forth. All right, enough about that. Did I mention that almost all the carbon that's captured from these is actually not buried underground? It's used for enhanced oil recovery. So there are many oil wells around the country where the remaining oil is too hard to extract, but if you can get CO2 under pressure and pump it in there, you can get some of that oil to come back out and kind of bubble out. So almost all of the captured CO2 from all these trials and from those some facilities, especially gas refineries, is going into extracting more oil. So if you put that into the equation, it's a mess. All right, commodification is another class of false solutions, and in particular, carbon markets, which essentially commodify carbon, which is in all living things, and some people in some places don't want their environment to become carbon molecules on a check sheet that are getting bought and sold by corporations that would like to continue to pollute, and that's essentially been a lot of resistance towards especially forest offsets. And I'm going to leave this a little bit because I'm kind of hoping that Anne will step in on this a little bit at the end. She's squinting at me like, but you can get on your airplane and they'll tell you, oh, it's all great, we're going to plant a tree, don't worry about the emissions, or buy this product and we'll plant 5 trees in your name. And first of all, you don't know that anybody's planting any trees. Second of all, you don't know that there's any carbon. And trees burn down, right? That's been happening, like offset projects have burned to the ground. So the fossil fuel pollution that it was supposed to offset definitely went up into the atmosphere. The smoke from the trees also went up to the atmosphere, and there was no real offsetting of anything in the end. There was just more emissions. But the whole issue around commodification and forests and what is a forest and offsetting, I'm going to hope that Anne will touch on that a little bit. I should have warned you. And then there's smoke and mirrors, which is back to the rhetoric, and I couldn't quite decide what to call this. There's net zero and carbon free and nature-based solutions, and everything's climate friendly, and this is Greta's blah blah blah. This is sort of the language of false solutions. What do those things mean? Essentially, the net zero, carbon free, all that stuff is accounting tricks with carbon. Figuring out how to say, well, we're going to do this over here, and that'll offset that many molecules of carbon over there. And, you know, I can't help thinking of those cars that have the label partial zero emission something. I was like, what? Partial zero emissions? That sounds like blah, blah, blah to me. It really does. But there's a lot of language out there, and people get pulled in. They think, okay, it's climate friendly. That sounds good to me. I like climate friendly. I'm friendly to the climate, aren't you? Yes, let's do this, right? And a lot of that is just based on really shoddy accounting, and Vermont has got a lot of really, really shoddy accounting going. Biomass is one of the really problematic shoddy accounting jobs that we've been fighting for a really long time because of this mythology about the carbon that comes out the stack is offset by a new tree that grew, and well, it took 0.02 nanoseconds to burn that tree to get the energy out of it. It's going to take 200 years to grow a new tree that might or might not grow and may or may not, there may not be a livable planet by the time we've had 200 years for it to regrow. It's certainly, we don't have that kind of time to waste. So smoke and mirrors and bad accounting. And then there's Trojan horses, and again, I think Anne will touch on this maybe a little bit. And I brought this up because Anne and I have worked for a long time on this genetically engineered chestnut. And you ask, what does that have to do with climate change? One of the reasons that I've been involved in that campaign to try to oppose the genetically engineered chestnut is because a bunch of guys got together and decided that they wanted to win over public opinion towards the commercial release of genetically engineered trees into forests. And there's a lot of public opposition to it. So what do? We pick an iconic species that everybody loves, the American chestnut. I love American chestnut. And we win over the public by putting this forward as a move to try to save a species. That's what it's really about, right? We're just nice people who want to save this species. But in the back rooms, they've been talking about how they want to win over public opinion towards the genetic engineering of forest tree species. And if you go to the academic literature, what you see is that there's about 5 trillion different journals that are looking at how to engineer trees to use them to produce more biomass, or to grow faster, or to tolerate the conditions of industrial monoculture plantations, or to be resistant to conditions of drought or other, and especially to be amenable to being refined into liquid biofuels. So that whole thing I mentioned earlier about cellulosic biofuels, which had been, embedded and ingrained into the renewable fuel standard, but still isn't in production. People would really like to be able to turn trees into fuel for your cars. The problem is that cellulose is a very difficult material to work with. And there's a reason for that. Trees don't want to get eaten. They want to protect their sugar. And accessing the sugars that are in cellulose is extremely challenging. So far, it hasn't really been possible to do it on a commercial scale. It's possible to do it. You can definitely do it. But to scale it up on a commercial scale is proving really difficult. So they're trying to engineer trees with altered composition of cellulose to allow genetically engineered microbes to access the sugars in the cellulose and turn it all into a goop that you can put into the tank of your car. So this genetically engineered chestnut is the Trojan horse behind a big industry looking at and working to engineer trees for the bioeconomy, if you will, including turning them into plastics, industrial chemicals. They're engineering many, many different traits into these trees, and the chestnut is the Trojan horse. So then there's energy magic, overcoming the laws of thermodynamics, and this is that is really what a lot of these false solutions come down to is overcoming either the laws of thermodynamics or the basic biology of living organisms. I take the example of algae biofuels. right? Algae biofuels have been getting subsidized, to the max for decades now. And guess what? There's no commercial production of algae biofuels. Some of you might have watched the Super Bowl a few years ago and you saw ExxonMobil up there saying, we really care about climate change and the environment, and so we are investing in green fuels. And that was their investment into a company that is genetically engineering a type of algae that they thought would, be more amenable to producing the oils that can then be turned into fuels. But the problem with all that is that algae, you can either encourage them to grow or you can encourage them to produce oil, but they don't, those are generally trade-offs and they don't do very well. You can also, it takes a lot of energy to run the systems that you grow those algae in. They have to have circulating water, and it has to be kept at a certain temperature, and you have to add different nutrients to the whole mix. And once they start growing in these reactors, they start shading out the other ones in the tank. They don't grow. So there's some really fundamental aspects also of the the process of photosynthesis that that some of these techno enthusiasts would like to go away, but they are firmly embedded in the processes of life here on Earth, and probably not ever going to go away. And it strikes me as slightly amusing when you go to like an EPA website and they have, production of biofuels for this year. We have biodiesel from soy and biodiesel from canola and and algae biofuels blank. And then there's corn and there's this and there's that. And they still put algae biofuels up there. And you will still hear people talking about algae biofuels are going to revolutionize our fuel industry, yada, yada, yada. In spite of decades of failure and very fundamental barriers to the production. So anyway, those are some of the, the brands or the types of false solutions that kind of came to mind. I've never really tried to do this thing of, categorizing them, but this was an opportunity to do that. And I'm sure I'm missing some things, but it's a way to think about it, and I think it might also be helpful in trying to assess and discern and think about things that are put forward to us as solutions, whether we can see, for example, is this a technology like renewable natural gas, right? Stuart Blood is here in the audience. Yay. Renewable natural gas, that's a Vermont favorite, right? And Vermont is in some ways leading the nation, if not the world, in promoting this idea that renewable natural gas is, going to actually exist. And I think I maybe have a next slide where let's go one more. Yeah, renewable natural gas is, right? It's really like, is it or isn't it? No, renewable gas, natural gas is produced in very, very, very small volumes. You'll see Vermont gas trucks driving around in Vermont with like renewable natural gas all over, and they're trying to sell this to their customers. They're trying to convince us that they are purveyors of a climate solution. First it was gas, natural gas, clean, carbon-free, forget about the methane, clean, carbon-free natural gas. Now it's renewable natural gas. So are we actually getting renewable natural gas? It turns out, no, not really. We are paying for environmental attributes from a nasty, lousy, polluting landfill in upstate New York and a wastewater treatment plant in Iowa. And maybe some molecules of gas from those facilities are actually going into the pipeline network nationally, but you are not getting more than a teaspoon a year of actual renewable natural gas, if any at all. But you can pay Vermont Gas a higher rate for this renewable attributes that they would like to sell us. So, like I said, it's just overwhelming sometimes to see the trickery that goes on with these companies and their willingness to say and do things in light of the situation that we find ourselves in.
So is the renewable natural gas that's brought to Vermont through pipelines
Yeah,
from these places you're talking
yeah,
about?
there's a whole network of pipelines all throughout North America and,
Right.
and beyond. And the gas that gets to Vermont goes through various different checkpoints along the way and comes, a lot of it coming from Alberta, and it's coming down through this checkpoint and that checkpoint. And at some point into this grid, if you will, of pipelines, the Iowa landfill is telling us anyway that they're putting some methane that they're capturing from the
Teaspoon in there.
yeah, yeah. So, you know, it's going into the system somehow, and we're buying the environmental attributes. And if you think that you're burning renewable natural gas in your living room, think again. The other thing about renewable natural gas is that it's very limited in supply. The most economical way to make renewable natural gas is in, for example, CAFOs, you know, cattle lot, the industrial scale cattle production, where you have, can I say this on camera, shitloads of poop, and you can have biodigester, and you can have an economy of scale there because it's costly to run these operations. So it's in very limited supply. I mean, we have Salisbury Farm here is putting like a couple of teaspoons in a year of gas from their farm, but only very large operations can manage the costs and make it. It's not something every mom and pop farm around the place is going to do. And Vermont Gas is not any mom and pop operation. I think most of you realize that by now. We've been fighting this gas pipeline for 8 years, and before that there were other people for another 8 years before that, I think. I don't remember when it was first proposed here. It was a long time ago, a lot of years ago. And there's a handful of people who are still fighting the damn thing. And we have moved away from challenging them on the climate aspects and the leaking methane and all the lies and stuff, to challenging them on the safety of the construction, because the more we got involved in looking at what was going on with the construction of this pipeline, the more we were absolutely flabbergasted. And we spent a lot of time demonstrating to the Public Utility Commission and reaching out to people in the public to explain to them what was going on with this pipeline that was just being slapped into the ground. They were way behind schedule, they were way over budget, they knew business as usual, they'd get fined, and that would be just part of the cost of doing business, and they slapped the thing into the ground in ways that were absolutely appalling. And we have friends and families who live on that pipeline, and we know that new pipelines are more likely to have major incidents and explosions and leaks than old pipelines. So we've been pushing and pushing, and I'll just, as one example, we finally got the Public Utility Commission to agree on 8, I think it is, counts of failure to comply with their certificate of public good permit. They had all kinds of fancy, we have diagrams of how we install it in this river, and we have this diagram that shows how deep we put it in the trench, and we install it such and such and so and so. Hundreds of pages of documents about all that they were going to do, and it was going to be done to Class 3 safety standards, especially for us Vermonters because we're so good. And it was all basically words. They just said whatever they wanted to say to get their permit, and they didn't expect that anyone was going to come hounding after them, but we have. And the Public Utility Commission has agreed with us that on at least 8 of the counts that we brought to their attention, they failed to fulfill the requirements of their certificate of public good. And now the question is, so what are you going to do? But first, let me tell you one of the major, almost, we gotta have a sense of humor. What they agreed with us was that they had failed to have a licensed engineer review the plans for construction prior to doing the construction, right? If you put a swimming pool in your backyard, you have to go to get a permit and have somebody, an engineer, approve the design is going to be okay. They built a transmission pipeline that goes next to schools and through people's backyards and over hill and dale through Vermont, farm country and streams and the public park in Heinsberg, et cetera, without ever having their licensed engineer. And it is required by law for them to do that. But they didn't do that. And so now the question is, what are we going to do? What is the Public Utilities Commission and the Department of Public Service going to do with this? So far, what it looks like they're going to do is say, this whole lengthy process with these annoying interveners who've just been pestering us over, they have uncovered and done all that we need to know. We won't learn anything new from doing another certificate of public good permitting process. So we'll just give them the permit, the revised permit. We won't bother with the whole public process that a certificate of public good is supposed to require, right? So that's the current state with that mess. Nice, clean, green natural gas, but there's some renewable natural gas, and Vermont Gas is trying to kind of construct themselves now as a energy conservation and renewable energy utility company, and I just say anyway. Can we go back one slide?
Sure.
I did want to touch on this one thing, which is, and I appreciate that Earl mentioned this too, because I think, one of the things that Ann and I had noticed on, about the youth movement that was coming up that kind of helped us to think about the need for something, a new edition of Hoodwinked. They're all up there saying 100% renewable energy now, 100% renewable. They go to climate marches and they're there, and the Sierra Club and Environmental Defense Fund and NRDC and all the big environmental organizations. 100% renewable energy now. But we need a reality check, because this is U.S. primary energy consumption by energy source. This little green wedge here is all renewables. And if you break that down, okay, this is solar, this blue is hydroelectric, the green is wind, and all of this is different forms of bioenergy. So slightly less than half of all renewables is some form of bioenergy, be it transportation fuels or burning wood for, and then there's mega hydro, which has got its problems that you'll hear about next week. And then there's some sliver of wind and solar in there, but this is the vast territory that to get to 100% renewable energy we would have to traverse if we were really going to get there. And we don't have the capacity to do that. We don't have room for that many solar panels or wind turbines, and we don't have the time to build it or the materials to build that. So a reality check. And to add to that reality check, this is something that Annette Smith sent to me this morning from a paper that looked at the rise in coal-fired generation from 1985 to 2021 by region. So this orange line is North America, and we have actually, cut back on coal here in North America, but the rest of the world is going nuts on coal, and so this is, one planet, and we need to have a reality check. The reality check that I think we need to have is that energy is not the sum total of what we need in order to, just changing flavors of energy is not what we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about how to live in a very, very different way. We need something that people have referred to as system change, not climate change. And we need to realize that the false solutions that have been constantly perpetrated are there in part because of the system of capitalism that we live in, where greed, money, profit making over people, shareholder satisfaction, all of those things have ruled the conversation, even taking over the climate negotiation centers as time has gone by. And that is the deep and fundamental kind of change that we have to make. Yeah, and who needs to make that? I think it's interesting to know that there are 25 fossil fuel producers who are considered responsible for 71% of the greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. And that the top 1% of the wealthiest people in the world produce something over 1,000 times more greenhouse gas emissions than the bottom 1%, somewhere around 200 tons per capita per individual per year in the uber rich. Reining in the uber rich and their consumption and their greed is one of the things that we have to do. And I personally think the only way that's going to happen is through regulation, which is very unpopular, but I don't see how it's going to happen otherwise. Markets are not going to take us there because they're the ones who are benefiting from the capitalist system so much. So, I've been kind of out of the loop on a lot of this stuff. As I said, I've been taking kind of a bit of a sabbatical from it all. But spending the last couple of days kind of reviewing some of this stuff has me just really like back in, oh my God, it's so frightening. And here we are on next to the hottest recorded day in history. The UN Secretary General said recently in a global assessment report on disaster risk reduction, he said, we are hurtling towards disaster with our eyes wide open. The synergies between disasters, economic vulnerabilities, and ecosystem failures are escalating the risk of a global collapse scenario. And I don't know, I feel it. I smell the smoke in the air. I feel the heat. It's tangible. It's not something we can think about future generations might have to deal with. It's here and now, and we need to get past all the false solutions. So thank you very much for the time. I want to turn it over briefly, if I can, to Anne, if she's willing, to say a few words. Anne is just back from a tour. Anne is just back from a tour of Brazil, where she was working with people who are resisting eucalyptus plantations and monocultures and so on.
Of course, I didn't bring my glasses. I don't know if my arm is long enough to read my notes here.
Do you want me to read to you?
Anyway, just a few comments on forest carbon offsets. I don't want to take up a lot of time because we're all here and we're all warm. And Rachel just did such a great job. I don't want to detract from that either. But basically, the idea of forest carbon offsets, that's a lot of what we're hearing when we hear, Rachel mentioned it, you can fly in a plane and you can buy offsets and it's fine, you'll offset your emissions. You can offset your emissions here and you can offset your emissions there. And many times they're talking about these forest carbon offsets. If you protect this forest here and the carbon that's in that forest, then you've saved the amount of carbon that's going out of the smokestacks of Chevron in California, for example. And that sounds very nice if you don't give it too much thought. But if you think about it, when global warming first started being recognized by scientists, in the 50s and 60s, there were billions of hectares more of forest on the planet than there is now. So the carbon emissions have been going like this, and the forests have been going like this. So they're saying now that we've got carbon emissions up here and forests down here, that we can somehow use these forests to offset these carbon emissions, which, it's mathematically doesn't make any sense. But it also doesn't make sense because we had a very nice closed loop system, if you will, of carbon dioxide on the planet. The plants were absorbing carbon dioxide, putting out oxygen. There was this whole system of the oceans and all of these systems working together to make a balanced, what was going on for tens of thousands of years was very comfortable climate. And now that has been totally thrown off by this sudden release into the atmosphere of all of these fossil carbons. So the industry likes to equate biological carbon with fossil carbon. We can offset the fossil carbon with the biological carbon, and you can't do that. They're completely different entities. They have nothing to do with each other except that they're all CO2. But aside from that, you just can't mix and match. It doesn't work that way. So they're now, what they're doing to protect the to protect the forests and the carbon in those forests is using more environmental injustice. So we were involved in a very specific campaign in 2011, the 2010 climate conference. California, Chiapas, Mexico, and Acre, Brazil made this three-way forest carbon offset deal where the forests in Acre, Brazil and Chiapas, Mexico could be used as carbon offsets for California and the companies in California like Chevron. So we went down to Chiapas to check this out because the community in the forest, this community called Amador Hernandez, was being threatened with eviction because the idea of protecting the carbon in a patch of forest means there can't be any people in there because they might burn a stick for fuel for cooking, or they might make some shelter, or they might use that carbon in some way. So that can't happen. So we have to create these human exclusion zones in these forests in order to be able to measure and secure that carbon. And so we went down there to document this. We created a movie called A Darker Shade of Green, and talked to the people down there, and they were going to resist, and they asked if our delegation would stay when the Mexican military was supposed to invade, and we did stay, and they didn't invade, so the community actually is still there. So the power of bearing witness and documenting is really important as well. I don't want to get into this too much. Rachel mentioned that I just got back from Brazil. Suzano is a major pulp and paper company. They're based in Brazil, and they have monoculture eucalyptus plantations all over the country. And they are now in the process in the state called Mato Grosso do Sul, which is covered with these beautiful cerrado forests, which are like a dry savanna forest. They're in the process of building the largest pulp mill in the world. And they're leveling the cerrado forest and putting in these monoculture eucalyptus plantations, which are not native to Brazil, as you probably know. They have no life in them. In Brazil, they call them green deserts because they just suck up all the water. They grow super fast, so they suck up the water. Nothing can grow in them. They're pretty horrific. Many communities are completely surrounded by them. The companies use a lot of chemicals on them to control termites and to control weeds. So the communities get poisoned. What little water they get left from the plantations is poison water. This contaminates their crops. It's really quite horrific. So they're building the largest pulp and paper mill in the world. They're expanding their eucalyptus plantations, at a crazy pace, like never has been seen before. And right behind them is a company called Arauco from Chile, which is another pulp and paper mill and pulp and paper company, and they are getting permits for what will be an even larger pulp and paper mill, which will be built in Mato Grosso do Sul. So Brazil is becoming this mega source for new pulp and paper, which is, the demand for paper is just going through the roof. So much less paper is being recycled that there's this huge new demand for fresh pulp. Nobody wants to recycle paper anymore. They just want fresh pulp. And so it's driving this massive deforestation and, injustice, social injustice, and just crazy stuff that's going on there and elsewhere. And I don't want to go into this for too long, but I just wanted to give you an idea. When you hear the words carbon offsets, when you hear the idea of planting trees to store, that was the part I forgot, sorry. Suzano, in cutting down all these forests and putting in all of these eucalyptus plantations, they're getting carbon offsets for that because they're growing trees. So, it sounds lovely. We'll plant trees and store carbon, but it's actually just, as Rachel said, smoke and mirrors, technocrat, bunk, nonsense, unicorn, fairy farts, I don't know. Whatever it is, it doesn't make a sense. So thank you, Rachel, for you did an amazing presentation. I appreciate it. And now I guess we get time for some heated discussion.